Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. My name is Olivier Boutilis. I'm the CEO of Accountancy Europe, and it's a great pleasure to be welcoming you today at this webinar. I understand I'm welcoming 900 people, which shows, I believe, the importance of the topic we're going to be discussing here today. And I would like to outline that this webinar has only been possible by uniting forces between Accountancy Europe, of course, but also ACCA, one of our great member bodies, SME United, representing SMEs in Brussels and in Europe, and IFAC, the International Federation of Accountants. And I would like to pay a special tribute, and I'll say a big word of thank you to the Czech Council presidency, who have agreed actually that this event is basically being organized with their support under their auspices. So today, the success of this event and the reason why 900 people across the continent are connected to this webinar is probably because of the importance of the theme. We're going to be talking about the impact of bribery and corruption on SMEs. Usually, this is a topic that is, being discussed in a multinational companies context. It hits the headlines usually in relation to a large, well-known brand. But the truth of the matter is that it affects SMEs with particular severity. Well, not only because SMEs are very often part of the supply chain of a larger organization, a larger business. So in a way, they face their own problems and also the problems of MNCs, but also because it may have a direct impact at an SME or a local level. Think about, employees, corruption, local politicians, or whatever. I think the sources of corruption and bribery are huge. And what's probably worse is that this was already a very serious discussion that we should have probably paid more attention to in the past. But today, I don't need to recall everybody that it's taking place in a totally unprecedented context, which shows multiple crises and catastrophes interconnected with one another. And well, I don't want to depress everybody, and I'm not going to talk about my favorite topic, which is climate and the environment, but these are issues that reach the level today of threatening humankind and its existence. But before that, there is someone a little bit further east from here that has the hand of a button that can also threaten our lives very quickly. And honestly, I never thought that in my generation, in my lifetime, I would see such a context. And this is what's happening. And the automatic result of that is that it is constraining economic circumstances. And I think we all know that it is when economic circumstances are most difficult, more stringent, that SMEs suffer most, and that the risk of being exposed to fraud, but also to bribery and corruption, are increasing. So I think that explains why the topic is especially important today. And as far as our members at Accountancy Europe are concerned, so professional accountants, and I'd just like to outline that the vast majority of them are SMEs themselves, and they are helping SMEs. I think we see that the role of accountants is twofold. It's not only to, I would say, help SMEs succeed. We all do that, and we've always done that. But it's also, I would say, to use a typical Anglo-Saxon form of words, help SMEs do the right thing. And I think that is especially important when it comes to corporate social responsibility and sustainability, which really are the major challenges of our generation. So we're doing our part of the job, but we also call on policymakers, regulators, enforcers, and all other stakeholders to join forces to guide the SMEs and help them reduce their exposure to bribery and corruption risk. And also that we all join forces to create more effective, more proportionate, and tailored anti-corruption and bribery approaches for SMEs. And I think it is very useful that I started calling on policymakers, because we have the pleasure and the honor today to be joined as our next speaker by an eminent member of the European Parliament, MEP Andrej Kovarik. And I hope I got this right, Mr. Kovarik. And Andrej is a member of the European Parliament's SME Intergroup and also the Econ Committee. And he's making us the pleasure and honor to provide his introductory remarks. Once we've heard from Andrej, we will move on to Nicolas Pinault, who is Deputy Director at the OECD. And Nicolas will give us an update on the OECD work on an SME support toolkit. Well, I wish everyone a very good event, and I'm delighted to pass the floor to MEP Andrej Kovarik. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Olivier, and thank you, Accountants Europe and all the other organizations for setting up and organizing this event. And also special thanks to the Czech presidency of the Council of the European Union. I think, well, we've been working on preparation of this event for quite a while. Various conditions and obstacles prevented us from organizing it, but I think in the end we managed to put it together. I'm really happy that we can meet online together in such a huge numbers and discuss a topic which, as Olivier rightly put it, is of crucial importance for SME community. And I think maybe now more than ever in terms of very difficult economic conditions that the SMEs are obliged to operate in these days. A lot of uncertainty, a lot of instability, rising costs of inputs going from energies to other inputs they need, and also very difficult conditions when it comes to supply chains, the cross-border operations, etc., etc. So I think this is very good timing. Maybe just to start with, to follow up what has been said, just a very quick overview. I'm pretty sure that we all know these numbers, but I think it's always worth repeating the importance of SMEs for the European economy. We have some 23 million of small and medium-sized enterprises operating in the European Union, together representing about 99% of all companies in the Union, and just over half of the European GDP, which I think it's incredible numbers. The companies employ around 100 million Europeans, and I think it's always right to say that they are the critical and vital source of creativity, innovation, and job creation. And the European Union has built the single market as a critical part of environment to enhance small and medium-sized businesses, the operating area, and to help businesses and innovators to grow and scale up and to find opportunities, but obviously not only in Europe, but always also beyond. We've been facing a very difficult period these past years, and I think the small and medium-sized enterprises were the most hard hit among the businesses. the stakeholders actually throughout these two crises. It obviously started with the pandemic and the difficulties back in 2020 with the restrictions and all actually the limitations that were put forward as part of a fight against COVID. But at the same time, built on that, as I mentioned, shortcomings in supply chains, issues linked to the shortcomings in labor force, shortcoming in the access to capital, and obviously, last but not least, sharply increasing prices of energies, and then most recently the security crisis and the war in Ukraine, which obviously puts a lot of instability and uncertainty ahead of us. And I think, especially in this very difficult environment, it's more important than ever, actually, to help SMEs to operate in a way that they can first make sure that their businesses can still continue to operate. That's on one hand, but on the other hand, they can also grow and make sure that they will not be losing their competitive edge, but also, I think, critical point, their possibility and power to create jobs and make sure that there is economic growth in Europe. When it comes to the specific point that we are about to address today on bribery and corruption, we saw also, among others, from the ACCA report dated from 2019, that, to be honest, until now, in terms of regulatory framework, that has been quite a limited attention actually paid to this topic, and I think rightly so. We should be more active in terms of addressing these issues throughout various legislative and non-legislative tools that we have in our hand. As Olivier mentioned at the beginning, I'm dealing with the SMEs agenda horizontally across various issues in my parliamentary work as a member of the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee, but also other committees. And despite the fact that basically on a day-to-day basis, discussing the SME agenda and SME issues, the bribery and corruption part of it, or let's say anti-corruption bribery and the ABC agenda, is actually very little represented in those discussions. Personally, I'm chairing a informal working group that we have established under the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee that deals with the access to finance for SMEs. And we always discuss, these issues, how the SMEs can be incentivized to access various forms of financing, how the financing and investment institutions can be incentivized to help SMEs to go and get the funds they require. But we never actually discuss what are the obstacles and what are actually the problems linked to the fact that there are not only systemic solutions in place, but there's a lot of, let's say, other tools that are used by other stakeholders actually to discuss that. And if we touch upon these issues of anti-corruption and bribery, very often we link it solely to the fact of anti-money laundering agenda. And I think to a certain extent, and in my view, to a certain extent, this is also very limiting, because obviously the anti-money laundering rules are strictly linked to only some part of activities. However, the bribery and corruption issues are much broader than that, and they can still have a huge negative impact on the way, on one hand, the SMEs operate, but also, for instance, on the way these SMEs are able to develop and grow their businesses, but also to access finance. And I think also linked to that, and directly, I would like to raise and reiterate our call, which I think we also repeat with many of our colleagues together with the SME community. We have to look at the issue of red tape and administrative burden, and I'm afraid, but by taking some of the regulatory steps, which in principle have a good intentions in terms of limiting the area of risks such as anti-money laundering or corruption, that by introducing such legislation, we are also adding additional red tape, and that we are adding additional administrative burdens to companies, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises, which usually have a hard time to cope with that. And also, by doing so, we may harm and undermine their capacity to increase their competitiveness compared to other stakeholders coming from other jurisdictions, for instance, but also to larger companies, which are usually better to comply with various sets of rules. And I think that is why I find, for instance, the above mentioned report of ACCA and further reports done specifically on EU-based SMEs so important, because it can give us policymakers, and I think that's both for us in the European Parliament, but also our colleagues in the Council and the national governments, to give us an additional perspective or broader perspective on how to approach our legal frameworks, to design them to encompass all types of businesses, and to also address various types of risks that those businesses face. And I think to be completely blunt and open and frank with you, I think we run the similar risk, as I mentioned earlier, also with the proposals on Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which, again, I think in principle and in terms of intentions are well designed and can actually offer additional safeguards to address the risk that we will discuss today. But at the same time, I think we should strike a very good and very difficult and thin balance, actually, in this regard, to make sure that these pieces of legislation actually deliver what we expect from them without additionally putting or additional burdening, excessively burdening, especially the small and medium-sized enterprises, which would have to cope with the obligations that are set by those directives. And I think this is usually the most difficult and the critical part of our work as legislators. But I think we should always have this as a sort of a primary goal to achieve. So I think that would be, in a nutshell, an opening part from my side. I would like to once again thank all the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak, but also I think for organizing this event, which I would like to follow with a lot of interest to see and to also learn about various perspectives. It has been mentioned the OECD toolbox will be presented right afterwards. But I think all the other types of initiatives that we can take on a policy level to make sure that we address the risk and we actually are able to cope with the risk that are presented by activities in the field of corruption and bribery, but also give the SMEs the sufficient and needed room for their maneuvering, for their operation, so they do not see the legislative framework as something that is usually putting a lot of burden, but a legislative framework that is enabling them to do what they are set for, their businesses and their core activities that they wish so. So I wish you all the success, very fruitful discussions today, and I'm really glad that we can continue and discuss this important issue also in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrej. And I have to say I agree with everything you've said. And believe me, if I wouldn't agree, I would tell you. So thank you very much for sharing your insights. I think it's also great to have, a young and engaged MEP in such a panel. I think you're helping us also bring a little bit of generation balance to the panel. Wonderful. Like Uto is going to help us bring a little bit of gender balance to the panel. I think these are important. But it's fantastic to see such an engaged MEP bringing the insights from the Parliament. Thank you very much. And before passing the floor now one level up from Europe to the OECD, I've seen already a provocative question in the chat. Asking how we would assess the risk of a kickback when performing an audit. And I have to say that is an intriguing question because I've never seen that in real life and practice, and because I'm unable to share any numbers on that matter. But I would like to outline actually a specificity of auditors in this kind of situation, because if we don't have numbers, if we don't have any contextual information to answer the question, we have practices, we have codes of ethics, and we have rules that tell us what we have to do in such a situation if it would happen. And the first thing very clearly is that the auditor would have to resign, to withdraw from the job. And I think we need to be entirely clear on that. And you see a number of auditors actually resigning, at occasions. Well, these can be one of the cause of resignation. The other thing that I think is important to outline for the audience is that would an auditor face, such a surprising circumstances? Because you would need to understand the rationale of such a thing. Because a kickback is usually aimed at something, and I'm not sure what this something would be here. But if there would be no, if there would be a counterpart to that offer of a kickback, the auditor would have to actually go and speak up with the board or the members of the board or the members of the supervisory board that, of course, were not those who offered, the kickback. And I cannot think of a situation where the entire board would do that. But if, for instance, one board member would do that, well, then it is the duty of the auditor to actually raise the matter with the other board members. And in certain countries, they may even have a duty actually to speak up to the authorities. So I hope that answers the question, but it's also a question that promises a very lively debate for this event, which is good. And I would like to invite everybody in the attendance to use Slido. You will see it on the YouTube page. To continue asking questions so that we have a fruitful debate today. And now, as I said, we're going to almost leave Europe for a moment and look at what the OECD is doing with their work on the SME support toolkit. Andre has already referred to that, and we're delighted for that purpose to welcome Nicolas Pinault, who is the Deputy Director at the OECD and who is going to give us an update. Nicolas, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Olivier, and good afternoon to all colleagues online. So it's my pleasure to join you for this discussion on the impact of corruption and bribery on small and medium-sized enterprises. As was mentioned before by you, Olivier, and also by André, and as you all know very well, SMEs play an important role in the economy. They create a large share of global gross domestic product, as well as many jobs. They are important drivers for innovation. Generally speaking, they dominate the business landscape, representing almost 99% of all businesses in the EU, and depending on the estimates, between 70 and 95% of all firms worldwide. And also, interestingly, they are also increasingly going international. And in that context, they are, of course, severely impacted not only by the ongoing inflation challenge, but also by the unstable geopolitical context, as was also pointed out by Olivier and Andrej. At the same time, SMEs are particularly vulnerable to corruption, especially as they are generally less able to keep up with best practices in compliance, especially compared to larger multinational enterprises. And this includes compliance for anti-corruption and bribery prevention. So there is this sort of, let's say, toxic combination of significant contribution to the global economy on the one hand, but also heightened vulnerability to corruption and foreign bribery on the other hand. That has therefore prompted governments, international organizations, and generally other stakeholders, including business associations, to pay more attention to the specific situation of SMEs. And many of these actors are now seeking to develop awareness-raising initiatives and integrity standards specifically targeted at SMEs, even though, as Andrej mentioned, this remains somewhat, let's say, overlooked by policymakers, and there is much more to be done there. And this is why the OECD is also focusing very much on this issue. But this is obviously this is easier said than done. The OECD Working Group on Bribery country monitoring reports adopted over the past decade show a constant challenge for government authorities to reach out to SMEs, and notably with awareness-raising initiatives. And this struggle has translated into recommendations by the OECD Working Group on Bribery to its member countries. And those recommendations were unfortunately often considered not implemented. And this is why this situation has actually informed the provisions on SMEs in the recently adopted 2021 OECD anti-bribery recommendation, which is a new instrument. It's a revision of the 2009 recommendation. And this recommendation puts much more emphasis on the specific challenge faced by SMEs. It encourages member countries, business organizations, and professional associations to play an essential role in assisting companies, in particular SMEs, in the development of effective internal controls, ethics, and compliance programs or measures for the purpose of preventing and detecting foreign bribery. The recommendation also includes good practice guidance on internal controls, ethics, and compliance. This guidance can, of course, be adapted by companies, in particular SMEs, according to their individual circumstances, be it their size, type, legal structure, jurisdictional requirements, and geographical and industrial sector of operation. The OECD is also developing, indeed, that was mentioned before, with the support of the government of Sweden, a toolkit for raising awareness and preventing corruption in SMEs. So this toolkit will be launched officially later this year, but I'm delighted, and I really want to thank the organizers for the opportunity. I'm delighted to be able to preview some of its preliminary findings today. So the toolkit will essentially provide examples of successful initiatives which government authorities, business association organization, professional associations, civil society organization, and large companies have adopted to assist SMEs in understanding their risk exposure and implementing the adequate anti-corruption measures. It is based on extensive background research, views collected by the OECD Secretariat from relevant country authorities, and interviews with anti-corruption compliance councils and specialists from several countries. The goal of the toolkit is to present a compilation of tried and tested awareness-raising initiatives that have proven effective in specific countries and industries. Just to give you a couple of examples, these initiatives include, for instance, the promotion of websites and portals with basic information, general guidance, and other online tools aimed at disseminating industry-specific anti-corruption awareness-raising initiatives to SMEs. It also includes the promotion of free brochures and welcome packages for current and new exporters and investors with simple to understand and engaging content on corruption prevention. It's also about promotion of e-learning, in-person trainings and conferences for SME representatives, promotion of legal incentives, and we are putting a lot of emphasis on this, integrity rewards systems, public registries of ethical companies, and preferential treatment for ethical SMEs. Promotion of incentives to large companies for them to provide anti-corruption compliance mentorship to SMEs. And the toolkit will also provide guidance on who should implement these initiatives and how it should be done. So let me start quickly with the who elements. The toolkit points to collaboration as the key. A collaborative, collective, and multi-stakeholder approach will result in a tailor-made, sector-specific, and resource-efficient awareness-raising strategy by sharing the cost with multiple stakeholders. It will also distribute the cost of implementing anti-corruption measures across those multiple stakeholders, avoiding overcharging SMEs or government authorities, especially in terms of crisis. That said, in general terms, government authorities have the responsibility of implementing anti-corruption awareness-raising initiatives for the private sector. But when the focus of this initiative is SMEs, government engagement with other relevant stakeholders is the better approach. Business organizations, for instance, generally have a leadership role in the business community. Their knowledge of the challenges and constraints of associated SMEs acting in a certain industry is obviously valuable when planning awareness raising and prevention of corruption initiatives. I also refer to that, but large companies, they have a critical role to play as well. The 2020 OECD report on corporate anti-corruption compliance drivers, mechanisms, and ideas for change indicates that pressure from the supply chain may be a particularly strong motivator in the case of SMEs, which may not fear enforcement of corruption offenses, but don't want to maintain business relationships with larger companies. Professional associations such as ACA also have a fundamental role to play. ACA and others can encourage and assist SMEs in developing internal controls, ethics, and compliance programs, or other measures designed to prevent and detect corruption. And the toolkit also points to collective action and public-private partnerships. The 2021 OECD anti-bribery recommendation encourages countries to support collective action and public-private partnerships as tools to raise awareness and assist businesses, in particular SMEs, to build up their anti-corruption strategies. In fact, the anti-bribery recommendation is the first key international standard to explicitly endorse the use of collective action to promote anti-corruption standards. So now let me move quickly from the who to the how. Here, the toolkit identifies some preliminary steps government authorities and other stakeholders can take before implementing such initiatives. For instance, relevant stakeholders should promote information campaigns focused on the positive impact of anti-corruption compliance on business results. They can also develop simpler and smarter anti-corruption compliance guidance and/or requirements for SMEs. These and other measures can help to create a positive environment that will facilitate SMEs engagement with awareness-raising activities. And once the scene is set, the toolkit then turns to creating an awareness-raising strategy. Here, relevant stakeholders should, for instance, promote public consultation, choose and adapt initiatives based on industry or sector-specific approaches, taking into consideration the risk exposure of SMEs doing business in that specific sector or industry. Avoid one-size-fits-all approaches, especially considering the differences in size and nature of business, and constantly evaluate and review the efficacy of the awareness-raising strategies. So, colleagues, this is obviously just a preview of some preliminary findings from the forthcoming OECD toolkit, but the toolkit itself goes further and deeper. We will launch, as I said, the toolkit later this year in November. And we will host a related webinar on promoting business integrity in SMEs. So we will be happy to follow up in writing with the date, time, and all the details for this event, and to some extent prolong this discussion that we're having today. So I really want to encourage all of you to join us for the launch and this webinar. But for today, of course, I look forward to hearing our panelists' views on this topic and further insights into how we can together help SMEs overcome these challenges. The OECD stands ready to continue its role as a key player in this global dialogue. So please count on us, and thanks a lot, Olivier, again for the invitation.
All right, thank you, Nicolas. Can everybody hear me? Very good. Hello again. My name is Scott Hansen. I'm from the International Federation of Accountants, where I'm a director of policy and global engagement. I'm looking forward to moderating our session from here on out. Before that, just to thank Nicolas Pinot again. Again, he is the Deputy Director of the OECD Directorate for Financial and Enterprise Affairs. Great to hear you talking about the toolkit and, of course, the OECD's anti-bribery recommendation. Just as a small point there, that was an important initiative, the recent review of that important initiative for IFAC. And we're really happy to see in Annex 2 the language about the role that professional associations can play in terms of supporting SMEs, and then also in terms of supporting ethics more broadly. Before turning to the panel, I'd like to thank also Olivier and, of course, MEP Kovarik, our organizers, Cecile at the ACCA and Johan at Accountancy Europe, and then, of course, Uta, Jason, Philippe, and Luc, our panelists, who I'll introduce more fully as we get started. Now, to turn things over to the panel, I'd like to remind our panelists that they have 3 to 4 minutes for our introductory remarks. We'll be starting with Uta. Uta Stiegel is the head of the Enforcement, Transparency, and Rule of Law Monitoring Unit at the European Commission's DG Home. So Uta, please, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me for this conference today. And I will start off the panel by looking at what the EU does in its policies to address corruption. Of course, from point of view of DG Home, we have a quite security-oriented point of view, but the policies are, of course, also helping businesses and SMEs in particular. So what can we say about the EU in general? It's one of the regions in the world which is one of the least corrupt, but none of the EU member states is fully free from corruptions. This is very clear in the perception that we collect on every second year in the context of the so-called Eurobarometers. It's a perception analysis of citizens and businesses that we conduct. And from that, we can see that this year, 34% of the companies replied that they see corruption as a serious problem in the EU. The perception, of course, varies considerably across the EU member states. So we have some countries where the proportion of companies for which corruption is perceived as a problem is very high. For example, and these data are published on our website, you can find them. In Romania, 70% of the businesses consider corruption to be a problem. In Greece, it's 75%. In Cyprus, 78%. And then we have countries that have very, very low numbers. Such low figures we observe, for example, in Denmark with 7%, Ireland 8%, and Estonia 9%. So that it's about perception really of people. So it's not really absolute cases, but it's a perception that companies and citizens have. That is important to say. What do we do on EU level to address corruption? The corruption chapter is one of the key pillars of the annual Rule of Law report. It's one of the major initiatives of the von der Leyen Commission, and it's a report that is coming out always in July every year and sets the starting point of an annual dialogue between the EU institutions, the member states, and national parliaments and other stakeholders on rule of law. As I said, corruption is an important part of that report. It's actually one of the 4 chapters. We closely monitor and examine in this report the legal, the institutional framework, the capacity on administrative level in the judiciary. We also look at the preventive side, whether there are reliable and effective integrity measures in place. That include preventing, addressing conflicts of interest, for example, ensuring transparency of lobbying, whether there are lobbying rules in place, interest disclosure systems, effective protection of whistleblowers, transparency of political party financing. And in general, while most member states have tools to fight corruption in place, we see that the trend goes towards making stronger anti-corruption policies. While still challenges remain, in particular also in the so-called high-level corruption cases, corruption that is really affecting the top levels, the high-level people. Looking beyond the rule of law report, we have also on EU level legislation that is relevant, I think, in particular for businesses, and that addresses the role of corruption in the private sector. There is a framework decision which is quite old, but which actually obliges all member states to harmonize their legal systems and to combat corruption in the private sector by criminalizing active and passive corruption in the private sector in the EU. With that, I will stop my little introductory remarks, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion with all of you.
Thank you very much, Uta. Maybe as a follow-up question, I know, of course, you mentioned the annual rule of law report, other things that the European Union does, but looking at the legal framework, do you think that this is an area where the EU is actually only intervening in a limited way? And is there more that the European Union can do in that space?
Yes, indeed. That's a very, very good question. The legal framework, I already touched upon this, is quite old. So there is definitely room to work on that. And also when you look at the legislative framework, the notion of bribery is really at the center of it. It's a sort of a bit old-fashioned approach to the problem of corruption, which nowadays is considered a bit of a broader issue also in legal terms, not only related to bribery. And in fact, we have very recent developments which are interesting. Our President von der Leyen, in her yearly State of the Union speech that she held in September, actually announced for next year an EU anti-corruption package. So she has clearly said that we need also to look inside the EU when tackling corruption, and in particular also looking at our legal framework, and we have to do our job here. And That is why in the coming year, she said, the Commission will present also measures to update our legislative framework on corruption. So we are actually working on that to put that into motion, and your conference will feed into these reflections, and we want to see how we can support member states best to more effectively fight corruption, also in the context of the legal framework.
Great, thank you, Uta. Obviously, very important activity there, this EU anti-corruption package. So it'll be certainly interesting to see how that all develops in the coming period. So now I'll turn things over to our second speaker. This is Jason Piper, the head of business law and tax at the ACCA. Always a pleasure to work with Jason. So Jason, over to you for your introductory comments. Thank you.
Hi, Scott. Thanks very much for that. And thank you to all the other speakers who've been on before me. I think the first point that I wanted to make is that bribery and corruption, of course, is an issue for SMEs everywhere, and perhaps more than some people might have expected, even in Europe. I mean, as Uta demonstrated with the more up-to-date figures than the ones that we had, it is an issue, and it's not a homogeneous issue everywhere across Europe. And perhaps, I mean, with our figures, we had 43% of respondents across Europe as a whole who felt that bribery and corruption in general is not a concern for SMEs, and maybe they're the people we most need to talk to. And as Olivier mentioned during his opening comments, the pressures have increased due to various factors recently. COVID, of course, is one, heightened geopolitical tensions. One of the biggest issues, I think, actually, is increased cross-border trade due to digitalization. Say, while maybe only 42% of people think that SMEs are at risk in Europe, if they're starting to trade around the globe more regularly, then of course we have the concern that they'll be dealing in areas like, for example, Central America, where over 80% of respondents think that bribery and corruption is a serious issue. Sub-Saharan Africa, again, in excess of 83%, where bribery and corruption is an issue specifically for SMEs. And as we've already heard, when moving into these new markets, or even when operating in existing markets, historically the guidance has tended to focus on the larger businesses and their needs and capabilities. And I think there are various reasons for that. And of course, in many ways, it's much easier to look at the one huge number of the grand corruption offences, bribery and corruption around huge infrastructure projects. They're clear and obvious numbers, and the impact of those when things go wrong can be very clear and obvious as well. And we have, of course, had examples of, for example, bridge collapses which have been linked to corruption in the tendering process. But equally, again, we've heard all the numbers about how important SMEs are to the economic driving room of business in Europe and across the globe. So we really need some kind of guidance which is suitable for SMEs, and to concentrate a little more on this sector. Now, business culture has often been cited as a key factor in the guidance on how to deal with bribery and corruption, but for many SMEs, they're really too small to develop their own distinct internal culture beyond that which comes directly from the founder themselves. Of course, if you have a huge multinational, it will have its own internal culture. Sometimes they're homogenous, sometimes they're fractured, and different parts of the business work in different ways. If you have only 3 people or only 10 people, it's going to be far more susceptible to the outside pressures and the environment that they're working in. So supply chain partners, even just the local sort of press and media environment of the approach to bribery and corruption, and how these issues affect society and the individual businesses. And that's why I think things like this new OECD guidance are so important. And it was really heartening to hear some of the sort of factors that Nicola was raising, you know, the enhanced awareness raising initiatives, and the fact that it is holistic. Everyone needs to take part in this. We need every stakeholder to recognise the specific risks that affect the SME sector and to understand what they can do to help counteract them. It's very easy to say every stakeholder. There's so many different types. We've got suppliers, creditors, the advisors, the regulators, all of whom will have an impact on how small business tries to cope with these difficulties that they're facing. But you know, I think we are making steps in the right direction. It's really important, and events like this where we get to come together and exchange ideas and explain with all of the interested groups in the room together, we can hopefully make some real progress on how best to move forward as well.
Great, thank you very much, Jason. Just to pick up on something that you were speaking about, and I believe also Nicola mentioned as well, is sort of the comparative point with respect to larger businesses. So maybe if you could dig into a bit about what are the specific things that larger businesses can do that SMEs can't, and see if there's ways to think about solutions through that comparison.
Yeah. And I think, you know, some of them, concepts like having a separate compliance team with its own non-executive director, unfortunately, that's never going to translate well to a smaller business. But one of the interesting findings from our last bribery survey was that whereas historically people thought that a strict compliance regime and heavy fines and penalties for those found guilty of bribery and corruption were important, that's fallen away. And instead, businesses were saying they need whistleblowing procedures and the relevant regulation around that. And when we get to things like whistleblower hotlines, that's something that many big businesses already have internally. And again, digitalization makes a difference. It's far easier to set something like that up now than perhaps it was a few years ago. But you still have the issue.
I think we've lost Jason.
Yeah, it seems that we've hit a snag with Jason's signal there. It seems like we are all still good otherwise. His camera's gone now, so perhaps we'll just move on to the next speaker. Hopefully Jason can reconnect in short order. So with that, I'll turn things over to Philippe de Koster, who is the president of the CTIF, CFI, which is the Belgian Financial Intelligence Unit. Philippe, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, and good afternoon to everybody. I hope that you can hear me. As you said, well, I'm sharing the Belgian FIU. I'm also a prosecutor because I'm an advocate general, and I'm in Paris right now because normally I'm supposed to attend the working group on corruption within the OECD, and I'm missing the report on Italy, which is being presented this afternoon. I'm just telling you this just to show you the importance, well, I'm giving to the fight against corruption, bribery, and the connection with money laundering. If I want to be a little bit provocative, well, for an FIU, when we are intervening, we are always intervening when things has been done. People have been bribed either because they were, well, asking for bribery, or because, well, they were compelled to be bribed. We are also intervening because we are looking at the financial transaction being reported either by the company auditors, by the external accountant, or by the banking institution. Or we are informed also by our foreign FIUs that money is being transferred in very strange circumstances. And it's up to the FIU then to establish something or to make the link between this, well, strange payment and the possible bribery. Normally in Belgium, accountants and company auditors are, well, what we call them obliged entities. So they are supposed to report to the FIU suspicious transaction, that means that they are not, compelled to find the predicate offense, just to tell us that something is going wrong. And it's up to us, to the Belgian FIU or to every FIUs around the world, to investigate and show the intelligence, the evidence which might establish the corruption and then laundering the proceeds of corruption. Frankly speaking, if I looked at, the number of files we have received during the last 4 years, I was, let's say, surprised just to see that the disclosure we have received from external accountant and company auditors are, all the time around 300 and 400 per year. That means that less than 1% of the disclosure we are receiving annually. It's practically nothing. And during the same period, we have sent cases to the prosecutor concerning, money laundering in relation with corruption or embezzlement by public official. We have submitted 4 cases. That's not a huge issue. That's not a huge number, sorry, but this is the situation. At the same time, we all agree that, we need to fight against corruption, that steps must be taken, to talk about the private corruption. And I'm also concerned about what we are doing in Belgium about private corruption. From the FIU side, the answer is quite simple. Nothing, because I have no cases reported of laundering the proceeds of private corruption, except that we need to define what we mean by private corruption. And when we're talking about match fixing in the football competition, it might be considered as private corruption. But nevertheless, it's something totally apart. What can we do at the level of FIUs to, let's say, help either the big companies or the small or medium enterprise in order to fight against either corruption or, to avoid being involved in a corruption scheme? We're just spreading all, the information we have gathered. We are raising the awareness of people, but nevertheless, something might occur. And then I would like to raise a very specific issue. I talked about company auditors, but I talk also about external accountants. External. So people outside the small and medium enterprise. But what are we supposed to do with, the internal accountants, those being employed by the business or the small enterprise? Are they supposed to field a disclosure to us? Normally, yes, insofar they are recognized as accountants. But there is a problem, and there it's all the question of the whistleblowing. And it's perhaps something which needs to be addressed properly, and that's perhaps something we are missing right now. So, I just there respecting the time frame.
No, thank you very much, Philippe. All very interesting there. Maybe as a follow-up question, and it's really 2 sides of the same question. You spoke on how some of the reporting was coming from the accountant, but what do you see as the role of the accountancy profession in combating bribery and corruption, I guess, from the perspective of the FIU? And then sort of conversely, how can the FIU, what are the best practices that they can use or employ when interacting with the accountancy profession to sort of solve these problems?
Well, from the FIU side, perhaps we should extend our communication, better focus our communication, just to explain what is going on, what is occurring, what might be the final sanction. Taken from the other side, I do have difficulties to talk to people and remind them of their ethics. it's up to the professional, well, organization to remind people with the ethics they are supposed to follow. But I think there is also something, well, very, very strange. When we are talking about corruption, we are always ready to fight against corruption occurring in our own nation. But insofar it's occurring outside, well, it's, well, less a problem, and sometimes it's not a problem. When we are talking with some companies also, either big or small companies, well, going or moving or trying to get markets in well, countries outside the EU, and I'm not going to mention these countries. Most of the people are telling us, you know, I am compelled to bribe, I am compelled to send money, even though I'm not expecting to do this. It's a matter of surviving. It's a matter of gaining markets. Otherwise, well, this is, well, I'm going to lose the market, I'm going to lose my business, and I will be forced to stop. So the problem is mostly also within the OECD, when we are meeting with each other to look at a situation. Something which is not affecting, for example, a small and medium enterprise, but might affect big companies. You know that normally bribes are not tax deductible. That's quite clear. So now take a subsidiary of a big company being fined for bribery. If the mother company is helping the subsidiary to pay the fine, they might be in a position to deduct the sum they are paying in their own country. And there we are not talking to each other, which is totally stupid. That's the big difference. But it's mainly a question of ethics. And I think most of the people within the attendance will tell us, well, that they do respect the ethics. But at some point, somehow don't outside these attendants. What can we do? Question mark. I have no answer. Sorry.
Thank you, Philippe. All very important perspective there. Obviously, the FIU very much at the center of these issues, so important part of the conversation, of course. Now over to our final speaker, Luc Hendricks, who is the Director of Legal Affairs and Enterprise Policy at SME United. Luc, over to you for your introductory remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. First of all, I would like to refer to the data that Jute gave in the beginning, because they are quite high. I think she said 34% of businesses consider corruption as a problem. And this is, of course, a very high number. And although she said it is perception, I think that even if it's a perception, we have to do something about it. And it's also a little bit striking that most of the business organizations, as it is a huge problem for SMEs, have not paid enough attention to this problem. While, of course, the fight against corruption requires efforts from and also commitments from the government, but also from the private sector and society, so everybody should be involved. And then is the question why it is that talking about corruption and bribery is not a very popular issue. First of all, and I think that also Philippe already mentioned it, it's the definition. What is exactly bribery? What is exactly corruption? And I think that a lot of companies even think that this issue is not of interest for them. And it's also I think for business organizations quite difficult to raise awareness on this, in the sense that you can difficult organize an evening on a session on fighting corruption, and bribery in your company? Because I think that a lot of people will say, oh, this does not apply to me. We need, if we address the issue of bribery and corruption, a more specific approach. For example, we can talk about bribery and corruption in a session concerning trading with foreign countries, and to say, okay, in this country there is a risk for corruption. For the other issues, a lot has to do with the personal attitude of the entrepreneur. And we should not forget that SMEs, the majority in Europe, are micro enterprises. So the role of the entrepreneur is quite important. And so there you can difficult ask from him to set up an anti-corruption program in his company, because you risk at the end to ask for him higher ethical standards or to improve his ethical standard. And of course, this is exactly what it is about, especially for micro enterprises, that in the past we have also worked concerning corporate social responsibility, that the issue of corruption and bribery is an issue of the personal values of the entrepreneur. On the other hand, we have also to see how we can improve the situation. Until today, and I hope that the toolkit of the OECD will change this, is that most of the toolkits concerning corruption and bribery are completely not adapted to the needs and the particularities of small and medium-sized enterprises. What we really need is some indications, some guidelines which are adapted to small and medium-sized enterprises, and this is certainly not the case. And then another issue, and I'm very happy that Mr. Kovačić mentioned this, is the whole issue of better regulation. We know that corruption is used to obtain scarce goods. So if public services function well and achieve to reach all those in need of the services in an acceptable time and at an acceptable price, then the reasons for corruption will simply disappear. So one of the issues our business organizations are working on and should working on is the issue of better regulation, and also to improve the functioning, and this is of course an appeal to the governments, improve the functioning of public services. And there also a lot can be done by e-government, by electronic payment, because they are reducing, of course, the possibilities for fraud. Because this is also an issue that I would like to tackle. Once again, I think it's very difficult to sensibilize SMEs or entrepreneurs on the issue of corruption and bribery in general. We should be able to, our business organization should try to embed it in a larger program, for example, on how to detect fraud, how to fight fraud, how to detect fraud through the internet. So more in a global approach than in a more instead of a more approach towards bribery and corruption.
Great, thank you very much, Luc. The voice of SME organizations is so important in this discussion, because I think one of the key differentiating factors between small businesses, SMEs and then large businesses, is SMEs don't necessarily have the time or the money or the resources to be engaged in policy debates around these type of issues. So it's so important to have representative organizations. here. As a question maybe to follow up there, in terms of the current policy framework around anti-bribery and corruption, is it really fit for purpose for SMEs? Do we need SME-specific standards to support SME compliance? So what's the perspective there from SME organizations? Is the regulatory and policy framework really fit for SMEs, or is it designed for large companies and not well suited for the smaller ones?
Well, it was already mentioned the actual CSRD, which will oblige large enterprises to report on their sustainability, and there indeed in the CSRD there are some references to bribery and so on. But I think that it makes no sense for micro enterprises to report on as I said, an anti-corruption program or a code of conduct. A code of conduct in a lot of cases, an SME can still be ported, but not about an anti-corruption program. And to report on this, I think this would be exaggerated. Of course, what every company should do is to have a sound accounting system, but on the reporting, certainly there is no need to. On the general legal framework, I do not think that we need there more changes. There are some issues with the money laundering, because there is still no full harmonization, for example, in certain sectors, on the amounts that companies can receive in cash. So there are still some problems for the internal market. But in general, I think that the legal framework which is in place is adapted and adopted to small and medium-sized enterprises, and that we do not need further regulations in this field. But once again, I mean, I did not do an assessment of this. So if there would be any sign or need for a review of existing legislation, then we will certainly look at it.
Great, thank you very much there, Luc. Now, having gone through all of the panelists, I'd like to actually jump to a number of the questions we've received through Slido. We've had a number of them all relatively connected on the same point. So I want to give this one over to Jason in terms of the professional accountancy organization perspective. So we've received several questions around mechanisms for ensuring accountants fulfill their responsibilities to combat corruption, about the adoption of no-quar, the non-compliance with laws and regulations standard within the International Ethics Code, and the need for whistleblower protection laws in jurisdictions, which of course connects to the no-quar discussion, because how are accountants supposed to be reporting things if they are not protected legally through robust implementation of whistleblower protection laws? So if you could speak to maybe all of those, the need for better whistleblower protection, how can accountants, or what mechanisms do accountants have to fulfill their responsibilities? These questions sort of thematically linked. So Jason, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Scott. And I hope my sound is a little bit more stable this time. Apologies for the issues earlier. Yeah, I mean, in terms of I think the first point you've asked about there is the whistleblower protections. And the point I was trying to make when I'm afraid I was dropped earlier was that, yeah, these are now seen as being perhaps the most important and the most effective way to help employees and businesses deal with the risk of bribery. And it plays to some extent towards the prevention rather than the cure. As say, the importance of a heavy compliance regime and penalties for those who are caught seems to have dropped away a little bit. And in many ways, it should be easier technologically these days to create those anonymous, if needed, reporting mechanisms, and certainly the ability to go to somebody specifically, I mean, the SME perspective, very often the individual to whom a report would be made is also inevitably going to be perhaps the person about whom the employee wants to blow the whistle. So this is where other stakeholders, so sort of governments or even trade associations, perhaps even large suppliers, can offer to put together some kind of support package so that those mechanisms, those routes are there. I mean, whistleblower legislation is, I think, still quite fragmented, certainly around the world, and even within Europe, it's not wholly consistent, and in particular, the attitudes towards whistleblowing in individual countries can be quite different. So we need perhaps to take a step back and say it's not just having the mechanisms, it's having the environment where that's the thing to do. And that does lead on sort of very well to the question about the IOSPA Code of Ethics and the NOCLAR requirements. Again, as these are rolled out, and of course all professionally qualified accountants should be fully aware of these things and be looking to comply with them anyway, but raising the awareness of how important they are in an SME perspective environment, and the particular role that the professional advisor can play, and in particular if they have the mechanisms available as a sort of separate and neutral route for escalating concerns about bribery and corruption. There's definitely a role there for the professional associations to play in putting together and creating the reporting channels, and also to some extent perhaps even acting as a filter before things are reported then on to the FIUs, where there's a more serious allegation or something that definitely needs to be acted on. That additional level of scrutiny from a professional advisor can certainly help to streamline the process and keep it all efficient and effective.
Thank you very much, Jason. I appreciate the perspective there. I want to bounce back to Uta and maybe go up a bit of a level here to the global cooperation landscape. So I know you obviously were talking about what the European Union is doing here, but what does the EU do sort of globally or in cooperation with other countries around the world at the international level to focus on corruption? Because obviously corruption is not is a borderless crime. So it's an issue that needs to be tackled not just within the European Union, but at the global level. So looking to understand what's going on there. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. As I said, yeah, we have to keep our own house, the EU, in order. But yeah, corruption is a global issue, so we don't stop at the EU external borders. But the framework in which we operate is an UN framework, for example. There is one of the big conventions, the UN Convention Against Corruption, which has been ratified by the EU and all its member states. So we are all bound by it, and it is actually the framework that is framing also our legal framework, particularly also as far as corruption in the private sector and bribery, embezzlement in the private sector is concerned. So this convention is really key. What is maybe interesting to say is that there's currently an implementation review of this convention ongoing. So all the member states, it's I think about 180 states across the world that are signatories to this convention are checked. It's a sort of a peer review that is happening, and also the EU is part of that process. So there are and will be continuous reportings and reports about these reviews of all the countries in the world and how they are implementing the convention, included the EU. Then, of course, also the OECD has an important legal framework. The EU Foreign Bribery Convention is an important instrument. It's unfortunately not applying to all EU member states, but it is a point of reference for us. And in the rule of law report, we are also looking at how member states are tackling foreign bribery. So we are not only looking at the EU internal, but also external. That's a bit the legal framework, where I would stop for the moment and see if there are any questions on what we do externally.
Thank you very much, Uta. I'm not seeing anything specifically come through on that, but give it a second there. And maybe I will actually turn to Philippe from the Financial Intelligence Unit perspective to hear about what they do in terms of international cooperation. I know there's the Egmont Group, for example, that's the global organization for FIUs. But maybe before Philippe starts, just to make a quick comment, Uta, you spoke about the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. IFAC had the privilege of being an official observer at the most recent Conference of State Parties for the UNCAC, as it's called, back in December of 2021, and had the opportunity to make a statement on the floor, on the record there, and made the important point that there's no better way to fight corruption than to become a professional accountant. So can't let this event go by without making that small plug there, as prompted by you. But with that, I'll turn things over to Philippe to hear about the FIU's perspective on international cooperation. Thanks, Philippe.
Yeah, thanks. Well, within the world of the FIU world, we are currently working within the Egmont Group. So there is a very strong and quick cooperation between all the FIUs. The problem is when we are touching or approaching the issue of corruption, and when we are supposed to ask our foreign counterparts to collect information about politicians from their countries involved in a corruption mechanism, the question is, how far can I trust the answers being provided? And well, the next step is, well, the next question is, why is this foreign counterpart not answering my request? In any way, well, the question is, when we are dealing with, well, corruption at high level, of course, when we are talking about some state, don't expect the FIU, which is also supposed to be part, well, of the government world, to be, well, to be more than ready to pass information to us. So up to a certain extent, there is indeed a limit. We can solve the issue because we have also Egmont has presented a paper, a toolkit for FIUs to fight against corruption and the laundering of corruption proceeds. Okay, everybody within the FIU world can read the documents. Everybody can say that it's going to implement it, but there is a difference between saying that you are implementing a document and effectively implementing the document.
Of course, and that issue or the gap between adoption and implementation is one we see in so many different ways. If you look at last year's, or I think it's from several months ago, the Financial Action Task Force, of course, the global anti-money laundering standard setter, set out a review of its fourth round mutual evaluations. And you saw the gap of something like 76% technical compliance and 25% implementation effectiveness. So you can see that sort of radical difference there. Now, we have one question come in through the chat that I think I'll start with Jason maybe, but also give Uta and Philippe a chance to answer before turning things over to Luke for a final question. And that is just how big a problem are the cross-border differences in terms of anti-corruption laws, implementation, et cetera. We obviously just touched on the implementation gap point a bit there, but Jason, maybe over to you to start, and then to Uta and Philippe if they want to chime in as well.
Yeah, I think as already been highlighted, I mean, Philippe has mentioned the issue with some jurisdictions actually treating bribes as tax deductible still, which can cause a problem at the higher level. For smaller businesses, it's often not so much what they know the law to be as what they feel they have to do business. And I mean, one of the examples that we were given in our research was the issue of what happens if a small business starts up somewhere where making these payments is, the norm, and then wishes to expand into another jurisdiction. What happens when they reach somewhere that the anti-bribery rules are actually imposed far more strictly? Do they have to, pay the bribes locally to be able to stay afloat and run the risk of being prosecuted in the foreign countries? Or do they have to effectively leave their original environment and just operate in the places where there is the stronger regulation that's actually enforced? So those differences in culture and differences in regulation could pose a real threat for businesses as they try to move across borders.
Great, thank you, Jason. And then Uta, Philippe, if you want to join in on that question.
I can maybe start. I mean, clearly, when you look at it from a different perspective, not from businesses, but from law enforcement and how you actually tackle and effectively fight corruption, of course, cross-border differences are a continuous problem in the EU. We can, of course, harmonize legislation and approaches in member states, but still there are differences. And then when you go outside the EU, when we look at our candidate countries, we also try to align legal rules to enable a good and well-working cross-border cooperation on these issues. And the farther you go, the more difficult, of course, it becomes. And I would guess that Philippe can add to that. Of course, the UNCAC is a very good instrument, but it's an international convention where enforcement is difficult. The review mechanism now with the different reports is one tool, but it shows that in many countries there is the need for technical assistance and improvements to be made, and that will remain an issue.
Of course. Thank you very much, Uta. Philippe, any last words on that topic from you?
Well, it's clearly from an FIU perspective, the cross-border aspect is not really an issue. It's not really an issue because we are just collecting information, gathering intelligence, but we are not prosecuting. So we can work together all over the world while talking about corruption as being defined by the UNCAC Convention and so on and so on. But from now, I'm just taking my head of prosecutors. From the prosecuting side, it's totally different because sometimes we do still talk about dual criminality. And we need, in fact, what has been obtained by an FIU should be, well, also used by prosecutors, but in the framework of the international legal cooperation. And there is indeed an issue, because sometimes we do have the intelligence, but it's not being transformed into evidence. And the court needs evidence, not intelligence. That's the main challenge we are facing.
Great, thank you, Philippe. Important point there about evidence and prosecuting these type of cases. Now, as a final question over to Luc, you have an IFAC, ACCA, Accountancy Europe audience here. So a lot of accountants in the audience to speak to. With that opportunity, can you talk a bit about what role you see for accountants in supporting SMEs for seeking advice on bribery and corruption? What message do you want to give to all the accountants in the audience that work with these type of issues on a day-to-day basis?
Well, Scott, I hope that everybody knows that, in fact, accountants are the first advisors of our SMEs. So in any case, they can play an important role in giving advice to SMEs in their contracts, also in analyzing the contracts. I give you one example, something that you should always check if you are dealing with a foreign company is if to see if for example, the bank account number is at the same name as the original person you have contacted with. So there are some tricks that and advices that an accountant can give, and also in looking at the necessary information. I think that also in the OECD recommendation, there is a good practice that there should be public available websites with the rules and regulations concerning gifts and hospitality and so on. And these are things that certainly the accountants can check for the SME owner. But in fact, something I forgot to mention is that we should also pay more attention to corruption close to the entrepreneur. I give always the example of tipping. Tipping is, of course, an accepted way, but when is tipping becoming a way of obtaining extra services? And it is exactly there that also the accountants can help and guide and corrupt. As first advisors of the accountants, they have certainly a role to play, because they have more access to information in order to find some difficult contractual communications.
Well, thank you very much, Luca, and appreciate the sort of the wisdom there from the SME perspective to all the accountants in the audience. With that, I'd like to pull our panel to a close and give everyone, all of our panelists, a final opportunity to make a closing statement. So if you could take 30 seconds or so to make any final remarks. We'll start with Uta, then go to Jason. I understand that unfortunately Philippe had to leave for an urgent meeting. So then Uta, Jason, and then to Luc before I introduce our closing remarks from Matej Blažek from the Czech Ministry of Justice. So Uta, over to you.
Let me dedicate my last remarks to the project we work on for a new anti-corruption legislative framework, the anti-corruption package. So I hope that we manage to create next year something that really helps to fight corruption across the EU, and also in particular brings positive changes to the small and medium-sized enterprises that are important. And I would invite everyone joining today this discussion to help us to contribute in public consultations that we will launch on that to that project.
Thank you, Uta. Jason, over to you.
Thanks, Scott. I think probably there's not an awful lot more to add to what's already been said beyond how encouraging it is to see the progress that is being made. I mean, a couple of people have mentioned that when we wrote the report in 2019, there was not very much out there at all to help SMEs or to raise awareness of the issues facing them. You know, here we are, we've got the OECD recommendation, we've got groups coming together, we've got, you know, all the different initiatives that we can work with. I'm just looking forward very much to hopefully keeping some momentum up there, and speaking again with the partners here today to try and improve things, so that maybe in 5 years' time when we have an event like this, it's about how much better things are, rather than what we need to be looking at more of the basics.
Very good. Couldn't agree more. I think it's an important point to realize in sort of the broader scheme of things how new these global instruments are: the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, the UNCAC Convention, sort of in a long-term perspective, all very relatively new instruments. So over to Luke for his final statement. Luke, to you.
Yeah, thank you. Corruption is a huge problem, and it undermines the trust of the citizens, and especially also the entrepreneurs in the democratic institutions and the processes, and especially in these difficult times. This is certainly something that we have to avoid, and therefore our business organizations, SME and United and our members, we are certainly willing to work together with OECD and with the Commission and with anybody else in order to fight corruption and to spread good practices against corruption.
No, thank you, Luke. Very much appreciated there. So with that, I'll bring our panel to a close. Again, my name is Scott Hansen. I'm Director of Policy and Global Engagement at IFAC, the International Federation of Accountants. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that earlier this year, IFAC published our Anti-Corruption Action Plan, which is a large-scale work setting out over 30 actions related to how IFAC, on behalf of the global profession, can make a difference in the anti-corruption and economic crime space. So this is the last word for me, everyone. It's been a pleasure moderating the event today. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to our closing speaker, Matej Blažek, who is the Senior Ministerial Counselor in the Conflicts of Interest and Anti-Corruption Department of the Czech Ministry of Justice, which is, of course, representing the Czech presidency at the Council of the European Union. So Matej, over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and thank you for the invitation. Let me also, on behalf of the Czech Republic and the presidency at the Council of the EU, thank organizers for having opened this very important topic for discussion, and thank all speakers before me. We heard a lot, and we heard very insightful remarks by all speakers. And let me touch upon some of those in my closing remarks. But even before, let me highlight what Mr. Kovařík already mentioned. Small and medium-sized enterprises represent 99% of all businesses in the EU. That's more than 23 million enterprises. And all of those might be exposed to bribery and corruption. During this conference, we learned how the OECD, the EU, and other organizations help with fight against corruption and how SMEs could mitigate the risks of bribery and corruption. The OECD revised anti-bribery recommendation is an important standard, as Mr. Nicola Pinot mentioned. And from the SMEs perspective, it recommends countries maximize awareness raising in the private sector to prevent and detect corruption and foreign bribery. It also recommends business organizations and professional associations assist small and medium-sized enterprises in developing internal controls, ethics, and compliance programs. Both the EU and the associations of chartered certified accountants shared insightful data on corruption perception and showed us how important it is to step up anti-corruption efforts. As we heard, no matter how strong anti-corruption framework might countries have, unfortunately challenges remain in the investigations and prosecutions of high-level corruption cases. Also, an important point was made. While holistic approach to corruption is needed, sector-specific approach to corruption prevention can be useful, for example, by focusing certain preventive measures on high-risk sectors. So the holistic, complex, or strategic approach, if you will, should be there as a baseline with the sector-specific measures to follow. And just to let you know, the Czech Republic performs quite well in the strategic setting in the fight against corruption. According to the OECD Public Integrity Indicators results, the Czech Republic outperformed by far the OECD average It scored maximum points possible in the coverage of strategic framework, evidence-based problem analysis, and transparency of the evaluation practices in decision-making. Also, the Czech Republic launched last year a strategic document for the period of 2021 to 2027 to support small and medium-sized enterprises in the Czech Republic. The document is to help SMEs navigate the business environment, help to access financing, and reach local and global markets. The document also includes recommendations on innovation, digitalization, low-carbon economy, and resource efficiency. So as all small and medium-sized enterprises are extremely sensitive to economic fluctuations and other factors that, for instance, larger companies often do not face, I think it is crucial to support SMEs as they help to shape the environment at the local level, contribute to building community cohesion and fostering interpersonal relationships. It is a strategic priority for the Czech Republic to support SMEs as they are crucial for the twin transition to both sustainable and digital economy. Now, let me move to what anti-corruption priorities for the Czech presidency are. An essential part of fighting corruption is corruption detection and investigation. And one way of how to help with the detection and investigation is through whistleblowers, as also mentioned by Mr. Jason Piper. The Czech presidency has a priority to discuss whistleblowers protection and adopt a comprehensive act on whistleblowers protection. The main objective of this comprehensive legislation, which transposes the EU Whistleblowers Protection Directive, is detection of illegal activity, including corruption, protecting whistleblowers against retaliation if they report illegal activity, and also reducing the administrative burden for private sector, including SMEs, to a minimum, and providing private sector with a guidance on compliance. To support the efforts and to open the discussion on the whistleblowers protection, the Czech Republic will host on October 26th and 27th an experience sharing conference on whistleblowers protection. The conference will host speakers from the European Commission, EU member states, EEA countries, and the United Kingdom, with topics focused on the implementation of the EU directive, anonymous whistleblowers, and the protection of whistleblowers in practice. I would like to also you to know that to accommodate the new legislation, the Czech Republic launched an extensive project on awareness raising regarding whistleblowing in the Czech Republic, which will help both whistleblowers and companies, including SMEs, to adapt to the new legislation. As you might know, the EU directive prescribes that private sector companies with 50+ employees establish internal reporting channel through which whistleblowers report corruption or other illegal activities. This alone could prevent damaging incidents for companies' reputation and can also save companies some serious cash. So let me close it here, and my overall takeaway would be that crucial is to make bodies working on anti-corruption cooperate with SMEs and to make sure the voice of SMEs is heard on every level and at every stage of policy making, which will, by the way, will be always quite a challenge among the tough competition of global corporations. So thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to our joint efforts to curb bribery and corruption further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matej, for your participation. Actually, thank you to all the speakers. Now we're now coming to an end of this very rich discussion. So I will leave the final word to Johan Barros from I Can See Europe. Thank you so much from ACCA and from all the organizers. Johan, over to you.
Thanks very much, Cecile, and thank you indeed to all the speakers, to all the participants, the amazing audience that has been so interactive and asking all these questions, and to the co-organizers, and indeed to the Czech presidency for kindly hosting this under their auspices, this event. It's always a pleasure to collaborate on this important topic of SMEs bribery and corruption, even though it's a very serious one, obviously. And we very much look forward to continued collaboration, possibly in the form of another follow-up event next year. And in the meanwhile, have a look at ACCA's and Accountancy Europe's and SME United's and IFEX websites for further SME-related events in the next weeks and months to come. So thanks very much, everyone. Have a good day.